December 31st, 1942. The Arctic Ocean, somewhere off the coast of Norway. Lieutenant Commander Robert Sherbrooke stands on the bridge of HMS Onslow, a single British destroyer weighing 540 tons, armed with 4 small guns. Through his binoculars, he can see what should be his death sentence approaching through the Arctic mist. The German pocket battleship Admiral Hipper, 14, 0 tons of steel and fury, bristling with 8-inch guns that could obliterate his tiny ship with a single salvo. But that's not the worst part. Behind the Hipper, emerging like a sea monster from the frozen hell of the Barents Sea, comes something even more terrifying. The German battleship Lützow, 16 Azusaron tons of pure destruction, carrying guns so massive they could sink Sherbrooke's destroyer from 20 miles away. The math is simple and brutal. 2 German battleships versus 1 British destroyer. It's not a battle, it's an execution. Any rational commander would turn and run, call for help or surrender. But what if I told you that Lieutenant Commander Sherbrooke did the exact opposite? What if I told you he ordered his tiny destroyer to charge directly at these floating fortresses, and that this seemingly suicidal decision would become one of the most shocking tactical victories in naval history? Before we dive into this absolutely incredible story of courage against impossible odds, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you're watching from. Are you in the UK, where this heroic story began? Maybe you're watching from Germany, where this battle is still studied in naval academies. Or perhaps you're somewhere completely different, discovering this amazing piece of history for the first time. I love connecting with our global community of history enthusiasts, and your comments always inspire me to dig deeper into these incredible stories. Now let's uncover the truth behind one of the most audacious naval battles ever fought. The story you're about to hear will completely shatter everything you think you know about naval warfare, courage, and the power of tactical brilliance over raw firepower. Today, we're going to reveal how a single British destroyer commander turned the basic principles of naval combat upside down, how he used the Germans' own strength against them, and how his suicidal charge saved an entire Allied convoy and humiliated the Kriegsmarine so thoroughly that Hitler himself flew into a rage. We'll explore the desperate circumstances that led to this confrontation, the brilliant tactical thinking that made victory possible, and the devastating consequences for the German Navy that reached all the way to the highest levels of Nazi leadership. By the end of this video, you'll understand how sometimes the most impossible victories come from doing exactly what your enemy expects you never to do. To understand how a single British destroyer came to face 2 German battleships in what should have been a massacre, we need to transport ourselves to the frozen hell of the Arctic Ocean in December 1942. This wasn't just any naval theater. This was one of the most brutal and unforgiving environments on Earth, where the sea itself was as deadly as any enemy weapon. The Arctic convoys to Russia represented one of the most dangerous missions of World War II. These supply runs, carrying vital equipment and supplies to keep the Soviet Union fighting against Nazi Germany, had to navigate through waters controlled by German U-boats, aircraft, and surface raiders. The statistics were terrifying. By late 1942, nearly 100 Allied ships had been sunk on these routes, along with thousands of sailors who died not from enemy action, but from the killing cold of Arctic waters. But these convoys weren't just strategically important, they were politically essential. Stalin was demanding that Britain and America prove their commitment to the alliance by maintaining the flow of supplies, regardless of the cost. Churchill knew that if the Arctic convoys stopped, the entire Eastern Front could collapse, allowing Hitler to turn his full attention back to Western Europe. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Convoy JW-51B had departed from Scotland on December 22, 1942, carrying 14 merchant ships loaded with tanks, aircraft, ammunition, and other vital supplies for the Soviet war effort. The convoy was escorted by a small force of destroyers and corvettes, brave ships, but utterly outgunned by the German surface raiders known to be operating in the area. The German Navy had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. Admiral Erich Raeder, commander of the Kriegsmarine, had convinced Hitler that surface raiders could succeed where U-boats had failed in cutting the Arctic supply line. The plan was simple and brutal: use fast, heavily armed ships to intercept Allied convoys and destroy them before help could arrive. The German force-hunting convoy JW-51B was absolutely devastating. Leading the attack was the Admiral Hipper, a heavy cruiser that was essentially a pocket battleship. With 8 8-inch guns, 12 4, 1-inch guns, and armor thick enough to shrug off anything the British escorts could throw at her, the Hipper was designed specifically for this kind of mission, destroying lightly defended convoys. But the Germans weren't taking any chances. Behind the Hipper came the Lützow, an even more formidable opponent. Originally designed as a pocket battleship, the Lützow carried 6 11-inch guns, weapons so powerful they could penetrate the armor of most cruisers from extreme range. Together, these two ships represented more firepower than the entire British escort force combined. The German plan was textbook naval warfare. Use superior speed and firepower to overwhelm the escorts, then systematically destroy the defenseless merchant ships. It should have been a massacre. German intelligence indicated that the convoy was protected by only a handful of destroyers and smaller vessels, ships that couldn't possibly stand up to battleship-caliber guns. Captain zur See Rudolf Stanger, commanding the Hipper, was confident of victory. He had studied the British escort tactics and knew exactly how they would respond to his attack. The British would try to form a defensive screen around their merchant ships, using smoke and evasive maneuvers to buy time for help to arrive. But help was hundreds of miles away, and Stange had more than enough firepower to punch through any defensive screen the British could form. Lieutenant Commander Robert St. Vincent Sherbrooke was not supposed to be the hero of this story. At 39 years old, he was a career naval officer who had spent most of the war in unglamorous escort duties, shepherding convoys across the Atlantic and Arctic. He wasn't a famous admiral or a legendary tactician. He was just a professional sailor, doing his job in the most dangerous waters on Earth. But Sherbrooke had something that couldn't be taught in naval academies: an intuitive understanding of how to turn weakness into strength. During his years of convoy duty, he had developed an almost supernatural ability to read the flow of naval combat, to see opportunities where others saw only disaster. His crew trusted him completely, not because he was reckless, but because he was never reckless without reason. HMS Onslow, Sherbrooke's destroyer, was a typical British escort vessel, fast, maneuverable but lightly armed and armored. Her 4 7-inch guns were designed for fighting submarines and aircraft, not battleships. Her armor was thick enough to stop machine gun bullets, but would be like paper against the massive guns of the German raiders. In any conventional engagement, she would be destroyed in minutes. But Sherbrooke wasn't thinking conventionally. As reports came in of the approaching German force, he began formulating a plan that would either save the convoy or get him court-martialed, assuming he survived long enough for a court-martial. At 0830 hours on December 31st, 1942, the moment of truth arrived. HMS Obdurate, one of Sherbrooke's destroyers, spotted the German force approaching through the Arctic twilight. The radio crackled with the report that every escort commander dreaded. Enemy surface ships bearing 220 degrees, estimated 2 heavy cruisers closing fast. Sherbrooke had perhaps 10 minutes to make a decision that would determine the fate of 14 merchant ships and hundreds of Allied sailors. The conventional response was clear: form a defensive screen, lay smoke, and try to buy time for the convoy to escape, while calling for help from the distant heavy cruiser, HMS Sheffield, and her escorts. But Sherbrooke could see the fatal flaw in conventional tactics. The German ships were faster than the merchant vessels and had longer range guns than his destroyers. A defensive battle would be a slow-motion massacre, with his ships picked off one by one while the convoy was systematically destroyed. The Germans had all the advantages: firepower, armor, speed, and position. That's when Sherbrooke made the decision that would shock the naval world. Instead of forming a defensive screen, instead of laying smoke and retreating, he ordered his destroyers to do the one thing no rational commander would ever consider: charge directly at the German battleships. Sherbrooke's decision to charge the German ships wasn't suicidal. It was brilliant tactical thinking disguised as madness. He had identified several crucial factors that conventional naval wisdom ignored, and he was about to exploit them in ways that would revolutionize naval combat theory. First, He understood the psychology of German naval commanders. They had been trained to fight defensive battles against superior British forces, not to deal with aggressive attacks from inferior ships. The sight of British destroyers charging directly at them would create confusion and hesitation, precious seconds that could be exploited. Second, he recognized the limitations of large naval guns in close combat. The massive 8-inch and 11-inch guns on the German ships were designed for long-range engagements. At close range, they couldn't depress low enough to hit small, fast-moving targets. By closing the distance rapidly, Sherbrooke could neutralize the Germans' primary advantage. Third, he understood the tactical doctrine that governed German surface raiders. They were under strict orders to avoid unnecessary risks and casualties. Their mission was to destroy convoys, not to engage in heroic battles with enemy warships. If Sherbrooke could make the engagement costly enough, the German commanders might withdraw rather than risk their valuable ships. But the most brilliant aspect of Sherbrooke's plan was psychological. By attacking when he should have been defending, he would completely reverse the tactical situation. Instead of the Germans hunting a fleeing convoy, they would suddenly find themselves under attack by an enemy who seemed to have nothing to lose. At 0930 hours, HMS Onslow led the charge toward the German ships, followed by HMS Obedient, HMS Obdurate, and HMS Orwell. 4 British destroyers, totaling less than 7 tons, racing toward 2 German battleships totaling over 30 tons. The disparity in firepower was so extreme it was almost comical, except that men were about to die. The German reaction was exactly what Sherbrooke had predicted: complete shock. Captain Stange, commanding the Hipper, couldn't believe what he was seeing. British destroyers were supposed to run away, not charge directly at his guns. For crucial minutes, the German ships held their fire, their commanders trying to understand what was happening. When the Germans finally opened fire, their gunnery was erratic and confused. The massive guns that should have obliterated the British destroyers were firing wild, their crews rattled by the unexpected aggression of their targets. The British ships, meanwhile, were closing the range with every second, their smaller guns beginning to find their targets. HMS Onslow took the first hit at 0945 hours. An 8-inch shell from the Hipper struck her forward gun turret, killing several crew members and severely wounding Sherbrooke himself. Shrapnel tore through his face, destroying his left eye and leaving him partially blinded. But instead of falling back, he ordered his ship to continue the attack. What followed was one of the most chaotic and desperate naval engagements of World War II. The British destroyers, vastly outgunned but supremely maneuverable, darted between the German ships like terriers attacking wolves. They used their speed and agility to avoid the massive guns while closing to ranges where their own weapons could be effective. The Germans found themselves in an impossible tactical situation. Their ships were designed for long-range combat, but the British had forced them into a close-quarters brawl where size and firepower were less important than speed and maneuverability. The massive guns that should have been their greatest advantage became liabilities as the British ships closed to ranges where they couldn't be effectively targeted. HMS Onslow, despite her damage and her half-blinded commander, continued to lead the attack. Sherbrooke, blood streaming down his face, refused medical attention and continued to direct the battle from his bridge. His crew, inspired by his example, fought with desperate courage, knowing that their only chance of survival was to press the attack. The turning point came when HMS Obedient managed to score a direct hit on the Admiral Hipper's engine room. The German ship's speed dropped dramatically, and she began to list to starboard. Suddenly the hunter had become the hunted, and Captain Stange found himself fighting for his ship's survival rather than hunting defenseless merchants. Now let's see this battle through German eyes. Imagine you're Captain Rudolf Stange, commanding the Admiral Hipper. You've been hunting Allied convoys for months, and you've developed a perfect understanding of how these engagements should unfold. The British escorts will form a defensive screen, lay smoke, and try to buy time while calling for help. Your job is to punch through their defenses and destroy the merchant ships before help arrives. But suddenly everything goes wrong. Instead of running away, the British destroyers are charging directly at you. Instead of laying smoke and retreating, they're closing the range and opening fire. Your gunnery officers, trained for long-range engagements, are struggling to hit small, fast-moving targets that seem to be everywhere at once. Your massive 8-inch guns, which should be obliterating these tiny ships, are firing wild. The British are too close, moving too fast, and your gun crews are rattled by the sheer audacity of their attack. You're supposed to be the hunter, but suddenly you feel like the hunted. Then disaster strikes. A British shell penetrates your engine room, and your ship begins to slow. Your list to starboard is getting worse, and you're taking on water. The destroyers that should have been easy targets are now circling you like sharks, their guns finding their mark with increasing accuracy. For the first time in your naval career, you begin to consider the unthinkable: retreat. Your orders were to destroy the convoy, but your ship is damaged and your tactical situation is deteriorating rapidly. The British have turned what should have been a massacre into a genuine battle, and you're no longer certain of victory. At 10:30 hours, just as the German ships were beginning to gain the upper hand through sheer firepower, salvation appeared on the horizon. HMS Sheffield, a British light cruiser, arrived with her escort of destroyers. The German advantage in firepower suddenly evaporated as they found themselves facing a much more equal fight. But the real shock for the Germans wasn't the arrival of British reinforcements. It was the realization of what had just happened. A single British destroyer commander had held off 2 German battleships for over an hour, saving an entire convoy and inflicting serious damage on ships that should have been invulnerable to his weapons. Capitan Stanger, his ship damaged and his tactical situation hopeless, made the decision to withdraw. The Lutzow, which had been hanging back during the engagement, followed suit. The German surface raiders, which had been sent to destroy a defenseless convoy, limped back to port having achieved nothing except a humiliating defeat. The convoy, meanwhile, continued on its way to Russia, its cargo intact and its escorts victorious. Sherbrooke, despite his wounds, remained on his bridge until the last German ship disappeared over the horizon. Only then did he allow himself to be taken to the ship's medical bay, where doctors worked to save what remained of his sight. The immediate aftermath of the Battle of the Barents Sea sent shockwaves through both the British and German naval establishments. For the Royal Navy, it was a stunning validation of aggressive tactics and individual initiative. For the Kriegsmarine, it was a disaster that would have consequences reaching all the way to Hitler himself. The German Navy had invested enormous resources in surface raiders, believing they could succeed where U-boats had failed in cutting Allied supply lines. The humiliating defeat at the hands of a few British destroyers shattered this strategy and exposed fundamental flaws in German naval thinking. But the real consequences were political. When news of the defeat reached Hitler, he flew into one of his legendary rages. The Führer had been promised that surface raiders would cut the Arctic supply line and force Britain to abandon the Soviet Union. Instead, his most powerful ships had been defeated by what he contemptuously called a few British fishing boats. Hitler's reaction was swift and devastating. He ordered the immediate scrapping of all major German surface vessels, declaring them useless and a waste of resources. Admiral Raeder, the architect of German surface raider strategy, was forced to resign in disgrace. The German Navy's role in the war was effectively reduced to U-boat operations and coastal defense. The tactical brilliance of Sherbrooke's attack lay in his understanding of the fundamental principles of naval combat and his willingness to turn them upside down. Traditional naval doctrine emphasized the importance of maintaining range and using superior firepower to defeat the enemy. Sherbrooke recognized that these principles only applied when both sides were following the same rules. By charging directly at the German ships, he forced them into a type of combat they weren't prepared for. Their massive guns, designed for long-range engagements, became liabilities in close combat. Their heavy armor, meant to protect against large-caliber shells, was irrelevant against the rapid-fire guns of the British destroyers. Most importantly, Sherbrooke understood that naval combat is as much psychological as it is physical. By attacking when he should have been defending, he created confusion and hesitation in the German commanders. They had been trained to fight defensive battles against superior forces, not to deal with aggressive attacks from inferior ships. The success of the attack also demonstrated the importance of crew training and morale. The British sailors despite being vastly outgunned, fought with desperate courage because they believed in their commander and understood that their only chance of survival was to press the attack. The German crews, rattled by the unexpected aggression of their opponents, never fought with the same intensity. The Battle of the Barents Sea fundamentally changed naval thinking about the relationship between firepower and tactics. Military theorists, who had assumed that superior weapons always guaranteed victory, were forced to reconsider their assumptions. The battle demonstrated that aggressive tactics, superior training, and psychological warfare could overcome massive disadvantages in equipment. Naval academies around the world began studying Sherbrooke's tactics as an example of how to turn weakness into strength. The principle of attacking into strength, charging directly at superior forces to negate their advantages, became a standard part of naval tactical doctrine. But perhaps more importantly, the battle demonstrated the continued importance of individual initiative and courage in an age of increasingly technological warfare. Sherbrooke's victory wasn't won by superior equipment or overwhelming numbers. It was won by one man's willingness to think beyond conventional wisdom and risk everything on a seemingly impossible plan. Lieutenant Commander Robert Sherbrooke survived his wounds, though he lost the sight in his left eye and bore the scars of his battle for the rest of his life. He was awarded the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest military decoration, for his outstanding courage and brilliant leadership. But like many wartime heroes, he faded from public memory as the world moved on from the conflicts of the 1940s. Sherbrooke never sought fame or recognition for his actions. In interviews after the war, he consistently downplayed his role in the victory, crediting his crew and the other destroyer commanders for the success. He understood that heroism in war is often simply a matter of doing your job under impossible circumstances, and he never claimed to be anything more than a professional naval officer who did what the situation required. But his tactical innovations lived on. The principles he demonstrated in the Barents Sea, the importance of aggressive action, the value of psychological warfare, and the power of turning enemy strengths into weaknesses, became fundamental parts of modern naval doctrine. Military academies still study his battle as an example of how superior tactics can overcome superior firepower. So why isn't Robert Sherbrooke a household name? Why isn't the Battle of the Barents Sea taught in every history class as one of the greatest tactical victories of World War II? The answer lies in the nature of wartime propaganda and the way we construct historical narratives about heroism and victory. During the war, the British government was reluctant to publicize the full details of the battle because it revealed how close the Arctic convoys had come to disaster. The story of a single destroyer holding off 2 battleships was almost too dramatic to be believed, and military censors worried that it might seem like propaganda rather than fact. After the war, the story was overshadowed by larger and more dramatic battles. The D-Day landings, the Battle of Midway, and the Siege of Stalingrad captured the public imagination in ways that a small naval engagement in the Arctic Ocean could not. The Battle of the Barents Sea became a footnote in military history, known mainly to naval historians and military professionals. But there was another reason for the relative obscurity of Sherbrooke's victory. It didn't fit the narrative that either side wanted to tell about the war. For the British, it was embarrassing to admit how close their vital supply lines had come to being cut by German surface raiders. For the Germans, it was humiliating to acknowledge that their most powerful ships had been defeated by a handful of British destroyers. The real lesson of the Battle of the Barents Sea extends far beyond naval tactics or military history. It's a story about the power of courage, initiative, and creative thinking in the face of impossible odds. Sherbrooke's victory demonstrates that the most effective solutions often come from doing exactly what conventional wisdom says you should never do. In a world that increasingly values safety, consensus, and risk management, Sherbrooke's example reminds us that sometimes the only way to win is to risk everything on a plan that seems completely insane. His willingness to charge 2 battleships with a single destroyer wasn't reckless. It was the result of careful analysis and creative thinking about how to turn weakness into strength. The battle also demonstrates the importance of leadership in crisis situations. Sherbrooke's crew followed him into what appeared to be certain death because they trusted his judgment and believed in his ability to find a way to victory. That kind of leadership can't be taught in schools or learned from textbooks. It comes from character, experience, and the willingness to take responsibility for impossible decisions. Most importantly, the Battle of the Barents Sea reminds us that individual actions can have consequences far beyond their immediate scope. Sherbrooke's decision to attack the German ships didn't just save a convoy, it changed the entire course of German naval strategy and contributed to the eventual Allied victory in World War II. Today, in an age of precision-guided weapons and computer-controlled warfare, the lessons of the Battle of the Barents Sea remain remarkably relevant. Military conflicts are still decided by the willingness of individuals to take risks, think creatively, and act decisively under pressure. Technology can provide advantages, but it cannot replace the human qualities that Sherbrooke demonstrated in the Arctic Ocean. The battle also provides lessons for anyone facing seemingly impossible challenges in their personal or professional life. When conventional approaches aren't working, when the odds seem insurmountable, sometimes the only solution is to do exactly what everyone expects you not to do. Sherbrooke's victory reminds us that the most effective strategies often come from turning conventional wisdom upside down. But perhaps the most important lesson is about the nature of courage itself. Sherbrooke wasn't fearless. He was terrified, wounded, and facing almost certain death. But he acted anyway because he understood that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the willingness to do what's necessary despite that fear. Today, as you face your own challenges and obstacles, remember Lieutenant Commander Robert Sherbrooke standing on the bridge of HMS Onslow, blood streaming down his face, ordering his tiny destroyer to charge 2 German battleships. Remember that sometimes the most impossible victories come from doing exactly what your enemies expect you never to do. Remember that in the frozen waters of the Barents Sea, a single British naval officer proved that courage, creativity, and determination can overcome any advantage in firepower or numbers. Remember that the most powerful weapon in any conflict isn't technology or superior equipment. It's the willingness to think beyond the boundaries of conventional wisdom and risk everything on a plan that seems completely impossible. And remember that somewhere in the Arctic Ocean, the ghosts of German sailors still wonder how their mighty battleships were defeated by a handful of British destroyers that should have been destroyed in the first minutes of the battle. They were defeated not by superior weapons or overwhelming numbers, but by one man's refusal to accept that defeat was inevitable. The next time someone tells you that something can't be done, so that the odds are too great, that conventional wisdom says it's impossible, think about HMS Onslow charging through the Arctic twilight toward ships that should have destroyed her. Think about the power of doing exactly what your enemies expect you never to do. Think about the courage to attack when everyone expects you to defend, because sometimes, in the darkest moments of our lives, the only way forward is to charge directly at the thing that terrifies us most. And sometimes, just sometimes, that charge can change everything. Stories like the Battle of the Barents Sea remind us that history is absolutely filled with incredible acts of courage and tactical brilliance that have been forgotten or overshadowed by larger events. There are countless examples of individuals who changed the course of history through their willingness to think creatively, act decisively, and risk everything on seemingly impossible plans. These are the stories that reveal the true nature of human courage and the power of individual initiative to overcome any obstacle. They show us that the most effective solutions often come from doing exactly what conventional wisdom says we should never do, and that the greatest victories are often won by people who refuse to accept that defeat is inevitable. That's exactly what we do here on this channel. We uncover these forgotten stories of courage, creativity, and tactical brilliance that change the world. We explore the moments when ordinary people did extraordinary things, when underdogs defeated seemingly invincible opponents, and when individual actions had consequences far beyond their immediate scope. If you're inspired by stories of courage against impossible odds, if you want to discover more examples of how creative thinking can overcome any disadvantage, if you believe that individual initiative can still change the world, then make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. Trust me, you absolutely won't want to miss what we uncover next. We're going to explore more forgotten battles, more unlikely heroes, more moments when someone decided to charge directly at their fears and changed history in the process. The truth is, courage is contagious, and these stories have the power to inspire us to face our own impossible challenges with the same determination that Robert Sherbrooke showed in the Arctic Ocean. History is full of people who refuse to accept defeat, and their stories are waiting to inspire the next generation of heroes.